Hello and welcome back to the Piskey Trap, a series where we explore the folklore, history and legends from across Devon and Cornwall. Hope that you're all keeping well and you've had a good few weeks. Thank you to all of you who've been listening to the series so far and to all the fantastic patrons over on Patreon for your continued support. I really appreciate that. I can't believe we're in November and people are starting to talk already about Christmas. With that in mind, I was thinking in December I'd like to collect together some spooky local stories to tell over the festive season. And I'd love to hear from you guys. Do you have any ghostly tales or stories from your part of Devon or Cornwall that you'd like us to explore? Or perhaps you've had your own spooky experience here in the southwest and you'd like to share your story. If so, I'd love to hear from you. If you'd like to get in touch, you can email me at thepiskeytrap@gmail.com or drop me a message on social media where you can find me as The Piskey Trap. Right, I think that's it for news really, so let's crack straight on with the episode. I thought it would be fun to come back to some classic storytelling. And this is The Piskey Trap after all. So I thought we'd take a look at some local stories relating to Piskies. We've looked at some in the past, and we've explored some local traditions and customs, but on this occasion I wanted to explore a few different stories that we perhaps haven't touched upon before, and delve into some of the themes that we find in stories surrounding these particular fairy folk as well. Often in the series you'll hear me mention writers that have cropped up in the course of my research. The likes of William Bottrell, Robert Hunt, they appear quite a bit, as well as Margaret Ann Courtney or Barbara Spooner. But in this episode, I wanted to take a bit of time to look at some tales that have been passed down primarily by two particular writers. And they are Ennis Tregarthen, who was based out of Padstow in the late 19th, early 20th century, and whose works included North Cornwall Fairies and Legends, The Piskey Purse, and The House of the Sleeping Winds. Then we have Jonathan Couch, who was a 19th century writer, physician and naturalist from Polperro, and his 1871 History of Polperro was published posthumously, and there are a number of Piskey tales in there, and it also includes writings by his son, Thomas Quiller Couch. So most of the stories we're going to be exploring come from these sources. And I should say at the outset that although I've made the odd little adaptations here and there, I'm going to be quoting from the original sources. So there may be instances where some of the words and phrasing are very much of their time. So there might be the odd little terms and things you wouldn't catch writers using now. But that's because I'm quoting from the original source material. So just a quick heads up there. Right. Without further waffling then, here are some Piskey stories. A recent old cottage tenant at Polyphant near Launceston, when asked why he allowed a hole in the wall of his house to remain unrepaired, answered that he would not have it stopped up on any account, as he left it on purpose for the Piskies to come in and out, as they had done for years. A quote there from William Philp in an itinerary of Launceston back in 1865. And it gives a lovely little insight into local beliefs and customs around the Piskies here in Cornwall. And alongside these local customs and practices, we find some fascinating storytelling traditions that seem to have been passed down over the centuries. Our first story comes down to us from Ennis Tregarthen, who, during the late 1800s and early 1900s, gathered together a lot of these local tales and traditions, including stories of Piskies. And in 1911, she published a book called The House of the Sleeping Winds and Other Stories. And in there, we find a little tale called A Piskey Who Rode in a Pocket, which I've adapted a tiny bit, but it goes like this. One day, a mischievous little Piskey, with long grey whiskers and wearing a green hat with a feather in it, was gambling along, when he found his way to Minster Woods up near Boscastle. Near the road to Lisnooth, he climbed up on a mossy boulder and looked around. He watched all the people passing along the path as evening drew near, waiting to see who he was going to have some fun with, when he saw a little old lady waddling up the path, carrying her shopping basket, and at her side was a large pocket known here in Cornwall as an Underdale pocket.
"That's the one,"
he said to himself.
"That great pocket is the perfect thing for me to take a ride in across the woods."
And as soon as the old lady passed by the boulder, he caught hold of her gown and dropped into the large pocket at her side. No sooner had he done so than the poor old woman looked around her bewildered. Somehow, she had completely lost her way. Where have I come to? I've got no idea where I am. But I'd best be on my way before it gets dark. She waddled on through the woods. Meanwhile, the little Piskey in her pocket was doubled up with laughter. He found the whole thing hilarious. She suddenly took a turning off the path, which led her even further from home. And each turning that she took left her more and more lost. I must be mazed, she thought to herself. The Piskey, meanwhile, was having the ride of his life. As she wandered hopelessly through the woods, night fell, and the woods were silent, save for the hooting of an owl off at Minster Church in the distance. Eventually, exhausted, the old woman sat herself down on an old tree trunk lying on the path, and then it finally dawned on her. She was Piskey-laden, and she knew the remedy was to turn her pockets inside out. And so with that, she turned her great pocket inside out, and as she did so, out fell the little Piskey man, causing her to shriek in surprise. The little fellow danced off down the path, laughing all the way. And the old woman knew her best way of finding her way home was to follow the sounds of his laughter. She waddled after him, until eventually, as day broke, she made her way over the bridge at Newmill and back home to Lisnooth. An interesting little story there, and a great example of what you might call Piskey mischief. We often find references by Cornish writers and folklorists around how these little beings delight in leading people astray, and this belief seems to go back a long way. In 1824, Fortescue Hitchins and Samuel Drew wrote in their History of Cornwall, and I quote, "If a traveller among the peasantry happened to lose his way, whether by daylight or in darkness, especially if it was a road with which he had been well acquainted, he immediately concluded that he was Piskey-led." And this is something that we occasionally find accounts for in the newspapers as well. I found an article in the Cornishman from 1878, where the correspondent had been speaking to an old farmer from over near Sancreed in West Cornwall, and they write, "The old man went on to say how every now and then he got Piskey-led on his way home to Selon. As sure as he missed the church road, he would be led miles about, round and round the same field, ere he could find it again. If he left the field, he seldom knew where he was again before the break of day, and then was most like to find himself near Bran Rings, which is Caer Bran, instead of on the other side of Churchtown." So here we have the idea of locals who become lost and disorientated, even though they know the area really well, sometimes finding themselves going round and round the same fields. Interesting that we also get mention there of the Iron Age hill fort of Caer Bran. And ancient sites like this in the landscape were often linked with fairy folk. We sometimes get mention of beings such as Spriggans, or Spriggans if you like, in West Cornwall, acting as sort of guardians of ancient sites. And in other examples, places like this are often referred to as offering a refuge for the people who had become Piskey-led. That somehow these sites offered protection from the power of the Piskies. There's a sense in the stories and the accounts that we get that these are beings that don't like being interfered with, and you certainly don't want to get on the wrong side of them. There's a particular story that springs to mind that comes down to us from Jonathan Couch in his History of Polperro, published in 1871, and it's called The Fisherman and the Piskies. He writes, John Taprail, long since dead, moored his boat one evening beside a barge of much larger size, in which his neighbour, John Rundle, traded between Polperro and Plymouth. And as the wind, though gusty, was not sufficient to cause any apprehension, he went to bed and slept soundly. In the middle of the night he was awoke by a voice from without, bidding him to get up and shift his rope over Rundle's, as his boat was in danger. Now, as all Taprail's capital was in his boat and gear, we may be sure that he was not long in putting on his sea clothes and going to its rescue. To his great chagrin, he found that a joke had been played upon him, for the boat and barge were both riding quietly at their ropes. On his way back again, when within a few yards of his home, he observed a crowd of little people congregated under the shelter of a boat that was lying high and dry upon the beach. They were sitting in a semicircle, holding their hats towards one of their number, who was engaged in distributing a heap of money, pitching a gold piece into each hat in succession. Now John had a covetous heart, and the sight of so much cash made him forget the respect due to an assemblage of Piskies, and that they were not slow to punish any intrusion on their privacy. So he crept slyly towards them, hidden by the boat, and reaching down, managed to introduce his hat without exciting any notice. When the heap was getting low, and Taprail was awaking to the dangers of detection, he craftily withdrew his hat and made off with the prize. He had got a fair start before the trick was discovered, but the defrauded Piskies were soon on his heels, and he barely managed to reach his house and to close the door upon his pursuers. So narrow, indeed, was his escape, that he left the tails of his sea-coat in their hands. Couch tells us at the end that this is an old local story, still remembered by the fishermen around Polperro. And we get the sense of a really narrow escape here. Although Piskies are often said to be fond of laughter and a bit of mischief, there's also a sense that they can be genuinely quite menacing as well, especially if they feel that they've been wronged or tricked in some way. Sometimes this is linked with them being seen. There was this widely held belief at one time that the Piskies were invisible unless you were Piskey-eyed, as it's sometimes called, or you had what was known as the Piskey sight. One way it was thought that you could get the Piskey sight was if you found a four-leaf clover, and often if you either looked at them through the four-leaf clover or passed it a certain number of times over your eyes, and this would give you the Piskey sight. In the stories that we have, there's a sense that they will show themselves to people if they wish it, but the Piskies don't like being spied upon. So there can be a real downside to having the Piskey sight. And this crops up in a fairly well-known story that I discussed a while back in an episode with writer Anna Chalton. It's often known as the midwife's story or the midwife's tale, but I thought I'd tell it in its original format. An old woman whose skill and good nature had made her the trusted nurse of the neighbourhood was sitting by her fire one night, very late, stooping over the flickering embers, when a loud knock at her door suddenly disturbed her zog or doze. The force of the knock and the rapidity with which it was followed by others louder still indicated great haste. So the old woman quickly opened the door, and peering over the hatch into the darkness, saw a pygmy man whose dimensions were made more diminutive still by contrast with the tall, sweating steed he rode. His business was soon told. His wife was in labour and needed immediate help. Nurse's demur to attend an unknown person when her services had not been previously bespoken was soon overcome as much by the liberal advance of earnest money put into her hand as by the urgent entreaties of the little messenger, and she mounted behind him on the bare-backed steed. They went by intricate ways and unknown turnings until they arrived at a house, where they alighted. The old woman was introduced to her patient, who was, in appearance, a fit mate for her dwarf guide. Her duty partly accomplished, whilst she was washing the baby, Nurse accidentally applied the soap to one of her eyes, when lo, a bit of fairyland was revealed to her. A crowd of Piskies thronged the room and went through unimaginable pranks. Through fear and discretion, she held her tongue, and her work being finished, she was taken by the same guide by unrecognized roads and deposited at her cottage with an ample reward. A short time after, the old nurse attended a large fair in the neighbourhood, and whilst moving about among the throng, she noticed the little man, her mysterious companion of the memorable night adventure, going from stall to stall, tasting and pilfering as he went. She accosted him with great simplicity and goodwill, inquiring after mother and baby.
"Ah, on which eye do you see me?"
said the elf. "On this," answered she, pointing to the one which had been smeared with the fairy suds. A blow from the Piskey fist, immediately and forever, made her blind on it, not only to fairyland, but everything else. So the tale taking quite a dark turn there, with the Piskey father caught out for stealing, realizes he's been seen, and in retaliation punches the poor woman in her eye, causing her to go blind in that eye. As I mentioned earlier, the Piskies can be quite menacing, and they're certainly not to be messed with. Some of you may remember a little while back I did an episode with Dr. Sharon Geddy, where we talked about the work of Anna Eliza Bray over in Tavistock and pixie stories there. And we discussed a very similar story to the Midwife's Tale. So it's obviously part of a storytelling tradition that we find not only in different parts of Cornwall, but also in parts of Devon too. Hope you're enjoying the episode. If you are, then don't forget to give us a like and subscribe. Maybe consider leaving a review, which can help other people to discover the series and also helps this project to grow. If you'd like to help support the series further, then please consider checking out my Patreon page at patreon.com/The Piskey Trap. This project is completely independent and it's funded by myself, along with the help of listener support. From as little as £1 a month, pledges on Patreon help me to cover the running costs and purchase books, materials, and gain access to historical archives as part of the research for each episode. So if you can help by offering a monthly pledge on Patreon, that'd be amazing. If not, no worries. Just continuing to spread the word among friends and on social media is also a real help. Okay then, that's enough of that. Let's get back to the episode. Back in the early 1900s, Henry Madden of Penzance talked of how the Piskies inhabiting the moorlands between Newlyn and St Just were considered particularly wicked, and that their great ambition was to substitute human children for their own. And this belief around changelings is something that we've touched upon before in this series, when we looked at Piskey beliefs and superstitions. And it seems to have been quite a widespread and genuine fear among Cornish parents at one time. When retired fisherman John Gilbert Guy of Sennon was interviewed back in around 1910, he said, and I quote, "The most fear of them was that they might come at night and change a baby for one that was no good. My mother said that Joan Nicholas believed the fairies had changed her baby, because it was very small and cross-tempered." This is something that crops up time and again in the interviews that were conducted by American writer and anthropologist Walter Evans Wens in the early 1900s. People recalling relatives or folk that they'd known in their communities who'd had a very happy and healthy baby, but then either something radically changed in the child's temperament, or they suddenly became very sickly, and the Piskies would be blamed for this. Another person interviewed was Jane Tregertha of Newlyn, who recalled that her mother had been friends with a couple who had been convinced that their baby was a changeling, and so they'd taken the child up to Mennon Toll. For those of you that don't know it, it's quite a famous formation of standing stones in West Cornwall. There was thought to be a Piskey guardian there that worked for the powers of good, and so the parents passed their baby through the central stone as part of a ritual to try and get their child back. All of this then caught up with a widely held and very old belief that the Piskies could steal away human children and replace them with one of their own. However, we also come across tales of a Piskey child that comes to stay with the human family, and probably the most famous of this story type is a tale that again comes from Jonathan Couch, and it's called Coleman Gray. He writes, "A farmer who formerly lived at Langreek was returning one evening from a distant part of the farm, when, in crossing a particular field, he saw, to his surprise, sitting on a stone in the middle of it, a miserable-looking little creature, human in appearance, though of diminutive size, and apparently starving with cold and hunger. Pitying its condition, and perhaps aware that it was of elfish origin, and that good luck would amply repay him for his kind treatment of it, he took it home, placed it by the warm hearth, and fed it with nice milk. The poor bantling soon recovered from the lumpish and only half-sensible state in which it was found, and, though it never spoke, became very lively and playful. From the amusement which its strange tricks excited, it became a general favourite in the family, and the good folk really felt very sorry when it quitted them, which it did in a very unceremonious manner. After the lapse of 3 or 4 days, as the little fellow was gambling about the farm kitchen, a shrill voice from the town place or farmyard was heard to call 3 times, "Coleman Gray," at which it sprang up, and gaining voice, cried,
"Ho, ho, ho! My daddy is come!"
flew through the keyhole, and was never afterwards heard of. Interestingly, we're told by Couch, at the end of the story, that a field on the Langreek estate retains the name of Coleman Gray to this day. The idea of the Piskey child also seems to be part of a storytelling tradition that was common at one time. And there's a similar tale from Launceston that there was once a family that lived in the town, and they had a regular Piskey visitor who would come to the house and entertain them with his tricks and antics. And so they would set out a particular stall especially for him. But then one day, the Piskey arrived, stood up on his stool, and suddenly announced,
"Piskey fine and Piskey gay. Now then, Piskey, run away."
And he disappeared and was never seen again. There's also a tradition of stories around the theme of Piskies performing work. Writer Thomas Quiller Couch, son of Jonathan Couch, wrote of how Piskies interest themselves in man's affairs. They might do you a good turn, they might help you by completing a task or performing some work, but to thank them for their help was construed as an insult. His father, Jonathan Couch, recounts a tale that seems to belong to a storytelling type that we find in areas all across Cornwall, which is known as the Piskey Thresher. This is what he says. The next legend is connected with a particular farmhouse in the neighbourhood, and well illustrates the capricious temper of the little folk, who are easily offended by an offer of reward, however delicately tendered. Long, long ago, before threshing machines were invented, the farmer who lived at Coleman's, on going to his barn one day, was surprised at the extraordinary quantity of corn that had been threshed during the previous night, as well as puzzled to discover the mysterious agency by which it was effected. His curiosity led him to inquire into the matter. So, at night, when the moon was up, he crept stealthily to the barn door, and looking through a chink, saw a little fellow, clad in a very tattered suit of green, wielding the dreshel, the flail, with astonishing vigour, and beating the floor with blows so rapid that the eye could not follow the motions of the implement. The farmer slunk away unperceived, and crept to bed, where he lay a long while awake, thinking in what way he might best show his gratitude to the Piskey for such an important service. He came to the conclusion, at length, that, as the little fellow's clothes were old and ragged, the gift of a new suit would be a proper way to lessen the obligation, and accordingly, on the morrow, he had a suit of green cloth made of what he judged to be the proper size, which he carried early in the evening to the barn and left for the Piskey's acceptance. At night, the farmer stole to the door again to see how his gift was taken. He was just in time to see the elf put on the suit, which was no sooner done than, looking down on himself admiringly, the little fellow sung,
Piskey fine and Piskey gay, Piskey now will fly away.
Or, according to other narrators,
Piskey new coat and Piskey new hood, Piskey now will do no more good.
The little rhyme variations that we have at the end of that story are ones that you'll often encounter around tales of Piskies performing tasks, and the stories tend to follow the same kind of arc, with the person wanting to show their gratitude to the Piskey by giving them a gift, in this instance a new suit, but as soon as this is received, they disappear and never return. All tapping into this idea that you shouldn't thank them for their help. But I also have to wonder if this connects to the idea of them being discovered or found out, and that this sort of undoes all the good work that they've done. There's one final theme that I want to talk about that appears in a number of Piskey tales here in Cornwall, and that is the peculiar theme of teleportation. We frequently find stories in which an individual is whisked away or goes on some kind of journey or adventure with the Piskies. One of my favourites of this story type is known as the Piskies in the Cellar, a tale that was traditionally told on Pickrus Night, the second Thursday before Christmas. It tells the tale of a man named John Sturtridge and his adventure with the Piskies. And I told that tale a while back in another episode, but there's another local tale that fits into the same type of tradition, and it comes from southeast Cornwall. It's known as A Voyage with the Piskies, and I discovered it through the brilliant work of a Cornish company called Mazed Tales, though the original story was written down by, you guessed it, Jonathan Couch. The story goes like this. About 1.5 miles to the east, on the shore of Talland Bay, is the hamlet of Porthallow, with its scattered farmhouses, and the green on which the children assemble at their sports. In old time, a lad in the employ of a farmer who occupied one of the homesteads was sent to Polperro to procure some little household necessaries from the shop. Dark night had set in by the time he had reached Sand Hill on his way home. When halfway down the steep road, he heard a voice.
"I'm for Porthallow Green."
"As you're going my way," thought he, "I may as well have your company." And he waited for a repetition of the sound.
"I'm for Porthallow Green,"
was soon repeated. "I'm for Porthallow Green," answered the boy. Quick as thought, he found himself on the green, surrounded by a throng of little laughing Piskies. They were scarcely settled before the cry was heard from several tiny voices,
"I'm for Seaton Beach."
A fine expanse of sand between this place and Plymouth. Whether he was charmed by his brief taste of Piskey society, or taken with their pleasant mode of travelling, is not stated, but instead of turning his pocket inside out, as many would have done, he immediately rejoined, "I'm for Seaton Beach." Off he was whisked, and in a moment found himself on Seaton Beach. After they had for a while danced their ringlets to the whistling wind, the cry was changed to,
"I'm for the King of France's cellar."
And strange to say, he offered no objection even to so long a journey. "I'm for the King of France's cellar," shouted the adventurous youth, as he dropped his parcel on the beach not far from the edge of the tide. Immediately he found himself in a spacious cellar, engaged with his mysterious companions in tasting the richest of wines. They then passed through the grand rooms, fitted up with a splendour which quite dazzled him. In one apartment the tables were covered with fine plates and rich viands, as if in expectation of a feast. Though in the main an honest lad, he could not resist a temptation to take away with him some memorial of his travels, and he pocketed one of the rich silver goblets which stood on the table. After a very short stay, the word was raised,
"I'm for Seaton Beach,"
which, being repeated by the boy, he was taken back as quickly as he went, and luckily reached the beach in time to save his parcel from the flowing tide. Their next destination was Porthallow Green, where the Piskies left our wandering traveller, who soon reached home, delivered his parcel, and received a compliment from the good wife for his dispatch. "You'd say so if you only knowed where I've been," said he. "I've been with the Piskies to Seaton Beach, and I've been to the King of France's cellar, and all in 5 minutes." "The boy's mazed," says the wife. "I thought you'd say I was mazed," answered the lad, "so I brought away this mug to show for it," at the same time producing the goblet. The farmer and his family examined it, wondered at it, and ended by giving a full belief to the boy's strange story. The goblet is, unfortunately, not now to be shown for the satisfaction of those who may still doubt, but we are assured that it remained the property of the lad's family for generations after. A great little tale there, which nicely demonstrates this sort of storytelling tradition that we encounter. Often we have an individual who encounters the little people, a cry goes up, that cry is repeated by the person, and they are then whisked away and join the Piskies on some kind of journey or adventure. Obviously, this particular example comes from southeast Cornwall, but I've found other stories from further west and in other parts of the county that seem to follow this same tradition that centres around the Piskies' ability to seemingly teleport to different places and carry people off along with them. That's pretty much it for this episode. I hope you've enjoyed this little exploration of a few different Piskey stories and some of the common themes that we find within them. There are many other stories and themes out there to explore, but I've no doubt that we'll be delving into some more of those in future episodes. And I'd be keen to hear from you guys as well. Do you have any similar local stories from your area? Perhaps you're not based in the southwest, but these seem familiar because they connect with examples of fairy lore, tales and traditions where you're from. If so, I'd love to hear about them. You can email me at thepiskeytrap piskey@gmail.com or drop me a line on Instagram or Facebook. Right, I'm going to wrap things up there, but we'll be back again very soon exploring a different topic. In the meantime, take care and thanks for listening. The Piskey Trap is written and presented by me, Keith Wallace, with music by Elizabeth Westcott and artwork by Caris Harrington.